She carried champagne through the top-floor ballroom of the St. Aurelia Hotel, with both hands steady and her face completely still. His mistress stood near the windows in white silk, smiling like the night had been designed around her. His mother moved from table to table, correcting the staff with the practiced authority of a woman who had never built anything herself, but had spent years acting as though proximity to power counted the same. His sister laughed too loudly at jokes that were not funny, and her husband, beneath a chandelier made of hand-cut Austrian crystal, welcomed investors, influencers, donors, and old family acquaintances into a celebration that should have embarrassed every decent person in the room. For 3 hours, Emily Parker Bennett served drinks in a hotel her grandfather had built. For 3 hours, she moved through marble and brass and gold leaf molding, while strangers brushed past her shoulder and asked for fresh ice, for another bottle, for clean flutes, for cocktail napkins, for someone to clear the table near the orchestra alcove. As if she were staff, as if she were temporary, as if she had no name that mattered. And the whole time, the ownership of Parker International Hospitality Group, 112 hotels across 12 countries, private coastal resorts, licensing rights, cash reserves, executive residences, and the controlling shares of a $31 billion empire had already been transferred into her name. She was serving champagne in her own kingdom. There is a kind of silence some women wear when they are afraid. And then there is the other kind. The kind that settles in after humiliation has gone too far, after grief has already torn through the heart and left something colder, calmer, and more exact behind. After the truth has arrived and chosen not to speak immediately because it understands timing better than anger ever will. That was the silence Emily wore that night. Not weakness, not confusion, not surrender. A decision. The St. Aurelia stood in the center of Manhattan like it had always known the city would bend itself around it. 53 floors of stone and glass, discreet entrances, warm amber light, private elevators, rare wood imported from old European estates, and the kind of silence money buys when it no longer needs to prove itself. Heads of state had stayed there. Film stars disappeared there between scandals. Old families hosted weddings there so expensive no one ever said the number aloud. Deals were made there behind closed doors, and then announced months later as though they had happened naturally. Emily had spent enough of her childhood in places like that to know the difference between luxury and theater. Her grandfather, Richard Parker, never taught her to be impressed by expensive things. He taught her to watch what expensive things were hiding. He used to walk her through hotel lobbies before sunrise, when the carpets still held the hush of the night and the front desk lamps glowed in low amber pools across polished stone. He would stop in the center of an empty lobby, place his hands in his coat pockets, and ask her the same question every time. What's the first thing people should feel when they walk in? Not see. Feel. When she was 9, she answered, "Impressed." He shook his head. When she was 11, she answered, "Safe." That time, he smiled. Years later, on her 18th birthday, he handed her a brass room key from the first hotel he had ever bought, a tired 12-room property in Savannah with weak plumbing, chipped stair rails, and a front porch that leaned slightly when it rained. He had the key cleaned, polished, and mounted on a narrow gold chain. "It's not valuable," he told her. "Not in the way people mean when they use that word. But it opens something more important than doors. Remember this, Emily. People who truly belong do not beg to be let in." She wore that key every day after that. She was wearing it the night Ethan Bennett asked her to refill his mistress's glass. He did not say it cruelly. That was one of Ethan's gifts. Cruelty almost never sounded cruel when it came out of his mouth. It came dressed in polished language, social ease, and the pleasant cadence of a man who had spent years learning how to say humiliating things in ways that left witnesses uncertain whether anything improper had happened at all. "Chloe's table needs another bottle," he told Emily, not quite looking at her as he adjusted his cufflink. "And try to keep up. Tonight matters. Tonight matters." As if she were the one who needed reminding. As if the woman he was still legally married to was the accessory in a night built on her own displacement. Chloe Mitchell was 28, beautiful in the way cameras reward, and professionally fluent in the performance of effortless desirability. She had moved from lifestyle content into luxury branding by understanding a simple thing early. Rich men like women who can make greed look tasteful. She knew how to stand in photographs as though she had just wandered into privilege by accident. She knew how to tilt her head at exactly the angle that suggested innocence without surrendering control. She knew how to act surprised by attention, while arranging her entire life around receiving it. For 6 months, she had been appearing more and more often beside Ethan. At first, at launches, then private dinners, then weekend stays, then charity events, then family functions, then here, at the St. Aurelia, at Richard Parker's flagship hotel, at the center of an empire whose scale Ethan had benefited from without ever truly understanding. Ethan had stopped pretending 3 weeks earlier. Margaret Bennett had stopped pretending long before he did. His mother had never liked Emily. Emily was too quiet for her, too self-contained, too difficult to read. Margaret trusted noise because she herself was made of it. She preferred women who displayed their gratitude constantly and their loyalty publicly. Women who performed approval. Women who made themselves legible through flattery. Emily never had. She listened more than she spoke, noticed more than she reacted, endured more than she explained. Margaret mistook all of that for weakness, because people often confuse restraint with emptiness when they themselves are too loud to hear depth. By 8:30 that evening, Margaret had already found 4 separate reasons to correct Emily. Her shoes were too plain. Her face looked cold. The west balcony had not been served quickly enough. And she was, according to Margaret, carrying herself as though she were emotionally involved, which in Margaret's world meant insufficiently invisible. Emily accepted every instruction without argument. That unsettled Margaret more than defiance would have. The ballroom glowed with candlelight and old jazz by the time Ethan tapped a spoon lightly against his glass to gather attention. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Chloe shifted closer to him. Margaret lifted her chin with the satisfaction of a woman who believed she had successfully replaced one future with another. Emily stood near the back, with a silver tray balanced against her palm. From there, she could see the room doubled in mirrored columns, people smiling at their own reflections, at one another, at the fiction being staged around them. Ethan smiled the smile he reserved for audiences. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight," he said, "for your support, your belief, and for standing with me at the beginning of a very exciting new chapter." A very exciting new chapter. Margaret clapped first. Then Ethan went on in the language men like him use when they are trying to make selfishness sound visionary. He spoke about reinvention, about growth, about alignment, about fresh direction. He never once used the word marriage. He never once used the word divorce either. Men like Ethan preferred transitions that looked elegant from a distance. Let the legal ugliness stay offstage. Let the flowers and lighting do the softening. Then Chloe placed a hand lightly on his arm. It was intimate enough for the room to register, public enough to humiliate, subtle enough to deny later. Emily turned away before anyone could study her face. She crossed into the service corridor behind the ballroom, where the velvet and brass gave way to stainless steel, white paint, and working light. The sound changed there. Softer, duller, honest. Her shoes clicked once, then again, against industrial tile. That was when her phone vibrated in the pocket of the black apron Margaret had insisted she wear. Unknown number. She answered on the third ring. "Miss Bennett?" The voice was male, older, measured. "This is James Whitman. I served as legal counsel to your grandfather, Richard Parker. I need to speak with you urgently regarding the settlement of his estate." Emily stopped walking. The hallway seemed to tighten around her. Her grandfather had died 6 days earlier at his Connecticut home, just after dusk, with rain tapping lightly against the library windows and one lamp on beside his chair. He had hated spectacle, so Emily had given him none. The funeral had been private. The board had been notified. The press had received a statement so brief it sounded almost unreal. He would have preferred it that way. No performance. No staged grief. No public appetite fed. But the estate had not yet been formally read to her. Not fully. Not directly. Mr. Whitman continued, careful in the way careful voices become careful when they are carrying numbers too large to feel human. "Your grandfather appointed you sole successor to Parker International Hospitality Group. All controlling shares, voting authority, domestic and international hotel holdings, associated investment portfolios, and executive residential properties were transferred into your possession as of this morning. Current gross valuation stands at $31 billion. Emily said nothing. On the other end of the line, Whitman let silence do its work. In the ballroom beyond the service doors, applause rose and fell around Ethan's voice. Emily lifted her hand to the brass key at her throat and pressed 2 fingers against it. "Miss Bennett?" "Yes," she said quietly. "There are additional documents requiring execution and several immediate operational decisions. The board is prepared to move at your direction." Emily looked through the narrow, wired glass window in the door. From there, she could see Ethan lifting a glass toward Chloe, while guests smiled as though betrayal became refined when paired with candlelight and jazz. "When can you meet?" Whitman asked. Emily looked at the ballroom, at the tray in her hand, at the reflection of herself in the steel service cart nearby. Then she thought of Richard Parker, who had built an empire without once mistaking volume for strength. "Come to the St. Aurelia," she said. "Top floor. 1 hour." She ended the call. Then she picked up another bottle and walked back inside. To understand why Emily did not break that night, you had to understand Richard Parker. He was not born into hospitality. He was born into repair. His father fixed boilers in old Georgia buildings where the heat failed in winter and landlords only acted when shame became expensive. His mother cleaned rooms in a roadside inn off Highway 17, where she learned every shade of exhaustion a stranger could carry through a door. Richard learned early that the line between dignity and humiliation was often no wider than a locked room, a clean sheet, a hot bath, or enough money to fall apart in private. He bought his first hotel at 32, after 15 years of sleeping 4 hours a night, taking disciplined risks, selling 2 small properties at exactly the right time, and never once borrowing what he could not cover if everything went wrong. He did not build loudly. He did not chase headlines. He bought what other men dismissed: old properties, poorly managed ones, buildings in good locations with bad reputations. Then he restored them slowly, carefully, patiently. He trained staff as though grace mattered. He taught managers that memory was part of the product. He understood something almost no one else in the business understood clearly enough. People come to hotels for beds, but they return for how a place made them feel when they were tired, grieving, embarrassed, newly in love, badly betrayed, or trying to begin again. By the time Emily was born, Richard Parker was already wealthy enough to disappear behind excellent accountants and several layers of corporate privacy. By the time she was 10, he was wealthy enough that no one in the family ever needed to mention money again. So they didn't. Emily was raised with etiquette, not extravagance; precision, not display; competence, not noise. She learned how to read staffing reports before she learned to drive. She knew how to spot panic in a guest before the guest opened their mouth. She understood lighting, timing, menu flow, turnover patterns, and the dangerous little lies managers told when occupancy was down, but ego was not. Richard never gave her numbers. He gave her principles. Never chase loud people into loud rooms. Never explain your worth to someone who profits from your doubt. And the one he repeated most: the longing is not something the world hands a woman. Sometimes it's something she has to remember. When she brought Ethan home to meet him, Richard said very little. That should have warned her. Ethan was handsome, charming, quick with conversation, and ambitious in a way that looked like drive until you watched him long enough to see it was really hunger without discipline. He loved the language of power. Loved the rooms where important people casually mentioned second homes and private memberships. Loved being near institutions older than himself because he mistook borrowed atmosphere for real substance. For the first year, Emily mistook his restlessness for potential. For the second year, she mistook his impatience for stress. By the third year, she no longer mistook anything. He had not married her for her money, not directly. That would have required knowledge Richard Parker never granted him. Ethan married Emily because she moved through elite spaces with ease and without performance. Because old institutions trusted people who had been raised around restraint. Because being beside her opened certain doors. Because her quiet legitimacy softened his sharper edges. He benefited from her without understanding her. That made him careless. Margaret made him worse. She fed him a version of Emily that made betrayal feel justified. She's too passive. She doesn't fight for you. She acts like she's above this family. She's hiding something. The strange thing was that the last accusation was the closest Margaret ever came to the truth. Emily was hiding something. Not deliberately. Only by inheritance. The Bennetts never once asked the right questions. Not about Richard Parker. Not about the boards Emily quietly sat on. Not about why certain people at charity galas treated her grandfather with unusual deference. Not about why general managers from cities she had never publicly visited still sent her handwritten notes at Christmas. They saw her softness and wrote her story for her. That was their first mistake. Their second was assuming quiet women always arrived empty-handed. By 9:15, Margaret found Emily near the terrace doors and handed her another tray. "Take this to Chloe's guests," she said, "and stand straighter. Staff should never look emotionally involved." Emily looked at her. Margaret held the stare for one beat too long, the way controlling women do when they are testing whether humiliation has finished its work. Then she smiled and walked away. Staff should never look emotionally involved. Emily almost laughed. Instead, she carried the tray into the inner lounge, where Chloe and three women in jeweled dresses were discussing honeymoon resorts, loudly enough to be overheard on purpose. One of them noticed Emily first. "Oh, perfect," she said. "Can we get sparkling water too?" Perfect. Not Emily. Not Mrs. Bennett. Not Parker. Just function. Just service. Just usefulness. Emily set the glasses down one by one. Chloe did not thank her. She adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist. A bracelet Ethan had purchased with money tied, more indirectly than he knew, to distributions from Parker Holdings he had spent years orbiting without understanding. There are humiliations so small they sound petty when repeated aloud. And yet those are often the humiliations that reveal the deepest truths. The tone, the entitlement, the unthinking assumption that the person before you exists to absorb your needs. By 10 o'clock, the room was flushed with champagne and self-congratulation. Ethan had relaxed into arrogance. Chloe had moved fully into performance. Margaret was introducing herself to guests from private equity and media as though she were already matriarch of something larger than her own life had ever built. Lauren Bennett, Ethan's sister, floated from cluster to cluster, laughing with the thin desperation of someone who wanted witnesses for her relevance. That was when James Whitman arrived. He did not enter like a dramatic man. He entered like a serious one. Dark suit, silver hair, flat leather folder. Two members of Parker International Executive Council behind him, and the chief of security for the St. Aurelia walking a respectful pace to the left. Emily saw him first. Then the general manager saw him and straightened instantly. Then the board liaison crossed the room. Then something subtle shifted in the air. Not enough for the guests to understand. Enough for the people who worked there to feel it. Whitman came to stand beside Emily without touching her. "Miss Parker," he said. Not Bennett. Parker. It was the first time that night anyone had addressed her by the correct name. Emily lifted her eyes. "I'm ready," she said. Ethan noticed the movement gathering around her and frowned. He stepped down from the platform near the piano and crossed the room with irritation already hardening his mouth. "Can I help you?" he asked Whitman, in the tone men use when they assume any interruption must belong beneath them. Whitman looked at him briefly, then beyond him. "To some extent," he said, "but not in the way you're hoping." Nearby conversation began to thin. Margaret turned. Chloe stiffened. Lauren stopped smiling in the middle of a breath. The general manager, a man who had sent Richard Parker handwritten Christmas cards for 12 consecutive years, moved to Emily's side and stood there with unmistakable formal respect. That, more than anything else, unsettled the room. Whitman opened the leather folder. The paper inside was thick, cream-colored, embossed, and sealed. "In accordance with the final estate directives of Richard James Parker," he said, his voice level and precise. "All controlling shares of Parker International Hospitality Group were transferred this morning to his sole designated heir, Miss Emily Parker." The room did not go quiet. It went still. There is a difference. Quiet is noise disappearing. Stillness is reality changing shape so suddenly that no one yet knows how to move inside it. Whitman continued. "This transfer includes the St. Aurelia Hotel, associated executive residences, all related operating entities, voting control across the Parker hospitality portfolio, and full discretionary authority over board appointments, vendor relationships, executive access, and private occupancy permissions." Margaret lost color first. Ethan stared at Emily with the beginning of fear. Chloe's hand slipped from his arm. Lauren took a step back without appearing to realize she had moved. Whitman turned a page. Current appraised estate value, inclusive of domestic, international, and private holdings, $31 billion. No one laughed. No one whispered. Because some numbers do not create noise. They create distance. Emily did not move. She let the words land. Let them spread. Let every cruel instruction of the evening meet the truth all at once. Ethan found his voice before he found his dignity. "This is absurd," he said. "There has to be some misunderstanding. Emily." Whitman cut across him with the clean authority of a man who had ended richer arguments than this one. "There is no misunderstanding." Then the chief of security stepped forward holding a tablet. "Mr. Bennett," he said, professional and expressionless, "your executive access, residential credentials, and discretionary privileges have been suspended pending direction from ownership. The same applies to all individuals registered under the Bennett family occupancy profile." Occupancy profile. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "This is outrageous," she said. "We are family." The general manager finally spoke. "Ma'am," he said softly, "you are guests." That was when the room truly understood. Not when the number was spoken, not when the lawyer arrived, not when Emily was called Parker. When the word guests replaced the word family. Guests could be welcomed. Guests could be managed. Guests could be escorted out. Guests did not own the building. Ethan turned fully toward Emily then, as if seeing her for the first time had become unavoidable, and he hated every second of it. "You knew?" he asked. It was a strange question, not because of the words, because of what sat underneath them.
"You knew who you were, and you let us continue like this?"
Emily looked at him with a calm so complete it almost felt merciful. "For 1 hour," she said. "Yes." Chloe stepped back. Lauren's expression lost whatever practiced ease had been holding it together. Around the ballroom, guests were pretending not to watch while missing absolutely nothing. This was no longer a party. It was a correction. Whitman placed the final document in Emily's hand. The St. Aurelia crest gleamed at the top of the page. Her grandfather's signature sat strong and clean beneath the transfer directive. For one brief moment, she saw him as he had been on that Savannah porch years earlier, placing an old brass key in her palm and telling her something she had been too young then to fully understand. People who truly belong do not beg to be let in. She closed the folder. Then she looked at Ethan. Her voice, when it came, was low, clear, and impossible to interrupt. "You had me serving your guests in my grandfather's hotel," she said. "I finished the shift. Now you and your family can check out." No shouting, no trembling, no dramatic flourish, just truth. That was all it needed. Margaret took a step toward her. "Emily, let's not do this publicly." Emily turned her head slowly. "You already did." Margaret stopped. Ethan looked as though he wanted to say a dozen things at once. Deny, explain, apologize, bargain, accuse. But men like him often learn too late that charm has no exchange rate in rooms where facts have already arrived. Whitman nodded once to security. The chief gestured discreetly. Additional personnel appeared at the ballroom entrances, not aggressive, not theatrical, just unmistakably final. Chloe was the first to leave. She did it elegantly, which is to say quickly. She picked up her clutch, avoided every eye in the room, and crossed the ballroom with the efficiency of a woman who understood that status had just evaporated around her. By morning, she would issue no statement. By evening, she would have unfollowed Ethan everywhere. Women like Chloe always understood collapse early. Survival, for them, depended on timing. Margaret tried anger next, then outrage, then maternal offense, then the language of insulted respectability. None of it worked. Lauren began texting furiously, likely to people who would now be slower to answer. Guests turned away just enough to appear polite while staying close enough not to miss a single second. Ethan remained where he was until it became clear that almost everyone in the room had decided not to stand too near him. Shame has a smell. Rooms detect it. Emily did not stay to watch the full collapse. That was never her style. She turned from the ballroom and walked through the private corridor toward the executive elevator, with Whitman and the general manager beside her. Staff moved subtly out of her path. Some lowered their eyes respectfully. Others looked relieved in the quiet, careful way employees do when justice has finally entered a building they thought had forgotten how. In the mirrored wall of the elevator, Emily caught sight of herself, still wearing the black serving uniform Margaret had chosen for her. For a second, she almost smiled. Then the doors closed. Ethan learned the scope of his mistake over the next 72 hours. Vendor accounts linked to his discretionary spending were frozen. The penthouse occupancy license expired. The car service contract was canceled. His consulting firm, which had built half its prestige on his assumed access to Parker-adjacent rooms, began losing confidence from the exact sort of people who had once mistaken borrowed influence for actual position. Margaret called Emily 12 times the next morning. Emily answered none of them. By Tuesday, formal notices had been issued. All Bennett family members were to vacate Parker-owned residences within the stated legal window. All non-essential privileges were revoked. All future communication was to pass through counsel. Lauren's fashion partnership, quietly dependent on event placement across Parker properties, dissolved when invitations stopped arriving. Margaret lost the charity board seat she had bragged about for years because the chairwoman, after learning the truth, suddenly remembered other candidates. And Ethan, who had loved standing in important lobbies as if belonging could be absorbed through flooring and light, found himself waiting in one as a visitor. He came to the St. Aurelia 9 days later, wearing a navy coat Emily had once bought him for winter in Zurich. He stood beneath the chandelier and asked the front desk whether his wife would see him. The receptionist, impeccably polite, made a call. Then she looked up with professional softness. "Miss Parker is unavailable." He remained there a moment too long, maybe hoping she would change her mind, maybe hoping the room would remember the version of him it had once tolerated, maybe hoping access could somehow be mistaken for forgiveness. It was not. He left through revolving doors designed to make departures look graceful. Some exits are still humiliating. 6 months later, Emily was in Savannah, not hiding, not recovering in the theatrical way people expect women to recover after public betrayal, not rebuilding in a manner designed to reassure outsiders that damage had occurred deeply enough to count. She was simply where she wanted to be. The first Parker Hotel still stood there, restored now, but not polished into lifeless perfection. 12 rooms, white porch, brass rails, magnolia trees near the walk. A lobby that smelled faintly of cedar, lemon oil, and linen in the mornings. Richard had preserved the imperfections that gave it memory. The floorboards still made their small, honest sounds in the hallway. The porch still held the rain a little longer than it should after a storm. Emily had chosen to spend a week there alone before the annual board summit. Whitman remained counsel. Global operations were stable. 3 new general managers had been appointed under her direction. Employee retention had improved across the domestic group. Bereavement accommodations had been expanded across all Parker properties. A quiet policy shift inspired by the week of Richard's death and the strange cruelty of how quickly the world continues moving around private grief. In certain ways, she was becoming more like her grandfather every year. Not harder, clearer. One evening, just before sunset, she sat on the porch with Richard's brass key in her hand and a letter beside her that Whitman had found among his private papers after probate closed. It had been written the year she married Ethan. Never mailed, never shown. Only folded carefully and sealed with her name on the front. She had read it many times by then, but one line remained with her more than any other. When the room changes, don't rush to prove you belong in it. Let truth introduce you. She folded the letter again along its original creases and placed it back inside the envelope. Then she looked out at the street beyond the gate as evening softened everything it touched. There are people who think stories like hers are about revenge. They are not. Revenge is loud. It demands witnesses. It feeds on spectacle. What happened to Emily was quieter than that. It was about memory. About inheritance in its deepest sense. About a woman being pushed so far out of place that she was forced to remember the place had always been hers. The Bennetts had mistaken access for ownership, attention for love, performance for power. And Emily had made only one mistake in the beginning. She had loved a man who admired rooms more than foundations. But she corrected it. Not by becoming cruel. Not by becoming loud. Not by becoming the kind of person pain often tries to manufacture. She corrected it by remaining intact long enough for truth to catch up. That is rarer than people think, and far more powerful. On her last morning in Savannah, Emily walked through the lobby before sunrise the way Richard used to. Lamps glowed low. A night clerk was finishing paperwork behind the desk. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone had started coffee. The front doors reflected the pale beginning of morning against polished glass. She stopped in the center of the marble floor. Empty room, soft light, silence. What's the first thing people should feel when they walk in? At 11, she had answered, safe. Now, older and steadier and far less interested in impressing anyone, she understood the deeper answer. Seen. Not managed, not measured, not tolerated. Seen. She touched the brass key once at her throat. Then she lowered her hand. And in the quiet lobby her grandfather had once taught her to read, Emily Parker stood exactly where she had always belonged. If Emily's story moved you, leave a key in the comments. And if you believe quiet strength is still strength, stay close.